Greetings and welcome to today's webinar, Pay for Success and the Department of Justice's Second Chance Act Solicitations. I'm Bill Pinikavich. I'm the Director of the New England Program for Nonprofit Finance Fund and a senior member of our team at Nonprofit Finance Fund who's been working for the last year and a half on building an enabling environment for Pay for Success financings. NFF will be the host for this webinar. And I'll be the moderator throughout. And what I'd like to do now is just stop and do a couple of quick logistics to make sure that we are broadcasting in ways that you all are receiving clearly. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of your screens, you will see a vertical column of icons. And the fourth and last at the bottom of that column icon is a hand. That is a raise your hand icon. If you could all just, if you can hear us clearly and see the screen clearly, please click on that raise your hand icon now. Okay, we're looking good. Thank you very much. So the structure for this webinar is the following. I'll be giving some brief introductory and logistical comments, then speak for about 15 minutes on the Pay for Success financing model in general terms, a general introduction to that. That segment will be followed by a 20-minute segment from Ruby Castlebots from the Department of Justice, who will talk about the solicitations. And then we will have an open 20-minute period or so of Q&A. And given the fact that we've had over 340 people register for this webinar, we're clearly not going to be able to answer everyone's questions in the 20 minutes provided, but within 48 hours of this webinar, a recording will be posted on the Nonprofit Finance Fund Learning Hub website and at DOJ as well, and we will have questions that are very relevant to the group as a whole that weren't able to be answered during the webinar, answered in that time frame as well. And on the issue of questions, you'll also notice in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, at the bottom of the box there is a box that says questions. All questions should be submitted by typing them in that box and clicking on the send button, or else we won't get them. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar. They will scroll up on our screen here, and we will make an effort to make sure that those questions most generally applicable and relevant to the Second Chance Act solicitations are the ones that we hit first as a priority. Okay? So Nonprofit Finance Fund is hosting today's webinar as a public service in its role as an independent, honest broker in the nascent Pay for Success field in the U.S. And with apologies in advance, I'll beg your indulgence as I present the following disclaimer that further clarifies NFF's role in today's webinar. Nonprofit Finance Fund is not acting as an advisor, agent, or contractor to the Department of Justice or any other U.S. federal entity in connection with the information NFF is providing on its Pay for Success Learning Hub website in support of the Second Chance Act solicitations, or in connection with the information it is providing in its role as host of and presenter during this March 6, 2012 webinar, nor has it received compensation of any sort from DOJ or any other United States federal entity for this informational support. NFF support is for informational purposes related exclusively to the general Pay for Success concept and is provided as a public service solely through its role as an independent, honest broker in the Pay for Success field. NFF will not be providing any information or commentary on the DOJ Second Chance Act solicitations, and NFF's informational support with respect to the general Pay for Success concept should not in any way be construed as an endorsement of or recommendation to submit an application in response to the Second Chance Act solicitations. Thank you. Let's move on to the general introduction to Pay for Success. And let me begin with just a couple of framing comments on Pay for Success. The Pay for Success financing concept is a technique for bringing supplemental capital into the social sector that has a number of unique and potentially transformative characteristics. Over the last 2 years, this Pay for Success financing concept has justifiably generated a lot of interest and attention in the U.S. In addition to the term pay for success, many of you have undoubtedly heard about social impact bonds, human capital performance bonds, the UK Peterborough prison transaction, and frankly may be a little confused by some of the terminology. So let's just frame the entire rest of this conversation by setting an understanding about vocabulary. So pay for success financing concept is what we're talking about here, and that's the umbrella term for this unique, potentially transformative way of bringing supplemental working capital to the social sector. Things like social impact bonds, human capital performance bonds, and other things are ways of doing the pay for success financing concept and are really structural variations of getting us to that pay for success overall concept. We're not going to focus on those structural variations because frankly they can be confusing, but rather we'll focus on the values and linkages that have created the interest and attention for pay for success. Let's go to this next chart here. We're going to start at 12 o'clock on that chart, number 1. And just as a preface to this, references to the term government that I make throughout this slide and the rest of the presentation are really referring to state, local, or tribal governments because this in the U.S. Is truly a bottom-up phenomenon from the governmental perspective. So the first point, the values and linkages in pay for success, entails a contract or other such agreement providing upfront working capital for preventative and or early intervention services. And that's core value number 1, a fierce focus on prevention and early intervention. Go to 1 o'clock, number 2 there. That working capital financing is linked to positive outcomes that produce cash flow savings against legacy government funding costs. And that raises the other two additional core concepts and values in the pay for success concept. The first is that it focuses on meaningful, measurable, positive outcomes for individuals, families, and communities of need. And 2, that there is an economic or monetary value associated with those positive social outcomes. And in fact, cash flow is created from these in savings, and that cash flow monetizes social impact and makes financing possible, the sort that we're talking about. Okay, number 3 on the list, success of a pay for success transaction equals achieving those contractually agreed social outcome targets, both the metric and timing, and then success then is always outcomes driven. That's one of the big aspects of pay for success. We're no longer focusing on outputs, it's outcomes. Number 4 here in the values is that there needs to be sufficiently verifiable measurement of those social outcomes against contracted targets. And what is sufficiently verifiable is an issue that is being worked out on a case-by-case basis in the field right now. 5th, most or all outcome performance risk is or can be shifted from government funders to private investors and or providers. Okay, so the key thing here, and this is why it's called pay for success and investing in what works, is that government does not take the risk of funding programs that don't work or don't produce meaningful, measurable, positive social outcomes. Move up to number 6 on that chart. Government funder is obligated to make success payments only if those contracted social outcome targets are hit. Again, we're paying for what works, and success payments generally are returning to the providers of working capital, investors, their original investment plus a return. And then lastly here, the final accounting of how a pay for success works. The government funder pays nothing in the event that the outcomes aren't hit, or retains a contracted portion of savings from successful investments after having paid back the investors. Okay, so that's the array of values and linkages that comprise the notion of pay for success financing. Let's talk about the transformative possibilities here, and that are really tied to the shift systemically in the marketplace from outputs to outcomes. And that's what all the kind of interest, excitement, and buzz is about. And some of the details of that excitement and the transformative aspect are indicated in the kind of uplifting forces at the bottom of this chart. So let me just tick through them quickly, some of which I've alluded to already. One, it promotes a more efficient and effective outcomes-driven service delivery, focuses on programs that work. 2, monetizes the positive social impact of prevention and early intervention. 3, produces cost savings, or in some cases revenues, plus lower risk to governments compared to current funding practices. The value is on a comparative basis. 4, aligns the interests of investors, providers, and governments on positive social outcomes. Important point, all parties to a pay-for-success financing are focused on the same objective, reaching those outcomes that have been identified up front as the agreement or contractual commitment. The other important point is that it integrates social and financial return on investment for the private impact investor pool and suggests scalability. There is an untapped demand for instruments in the marketplace that combine financial return and social return, and a shortage of those instruments. And part of the intense interest in pay for success is that it promotes and develops vehicles which do provide that to what's called the impact investor community. And lastly, we already alluded to that, there's a more productive allocation of risk among investors, governments, and service providers. But in addition to these very positive and possibly transformational aspects, there are barriers and hurdles to adapting the pay-for-success financing concept in the U.S. Okay, and these are those downward pushing sort of forces. And let me hit a few of these. First of all, they tend to be highly complex and customized multi-party transactions, which can be hard to do initially. Second, the proof of concept is not yet achieved in the original and only completed transaction to date, which was the one I mentioned earlier, the Peterborough prison transaction in the UK. Very promising early results from that transaction, but not yet definitively proving concept, and won't for some months now. There was also a multi-layer and overlapping government funding in the U.S. can create additional complexity and difficulty in trying to do these transactions. Another aspect which gets overlooked often in the conversation about pay for success is the readiness of service providers to adapt to pay for success delivery requirements. There's oftentimes kind of a black box assumption that all you need to do is put capital in the front end of a nonprofit service provider or a for-profit for that matter, then magic happens somehow internally, and the outputs and the outcomes that you're looking for, that's not the case. These are learned capabilities. And lastly, uncertainties over the cost of metrics, scalability, and equity and access to pay-for-success working capital, and the transparency of these transactions as well. Now, yes, these are hurdles, but you should be aware that all of these issues are in the process of being addressed in the marketplace. And I want to focus in some more detail on one of them that will be of particular interest to those of you on this call. And that's assessing service provider readiness, those capacities needed for pay for success, or as the orange oval indicates, those service provider readiness and capacity indicators. And now, this is not the definitive statement on this chart about what those capacities and those readiness indicators are. There's actually a more detailed provider readiness self-assessment that you can access on the Nonprofit Finance Fund Learning Hub, which goes into more detail, but these are certainly the core ones. So let me tick through them with you quickly. First of all, a history and culture of using outcome metrics to evaluate program performance, obviously a key fundamental characteristic of providers to be able to participate successfully and pay for success. In addition to that, a track record of success in setting and achieving challenging outcome metric targets. Business models and executives with preventative service delivery capacity and experience. And given how core prevention, early intervention is on this. That's kind of a core cultural element to a service provider operating successfully in Pay for Success. The institutional capacity to support scaling up and time horizon requirements of Pay for Success. Keep in mind, in Pay for Success, you need to hit outcome metric targets on a schedule. And the ability of institutions to operate on that basis is an important precondition to success in Pay for Success as well. Next is the planning, budgeting, and execution experience to manage upfront Pay for Success capital, and that includes the ability to do really robust projections and modeling on a forward-looking basis that allows you to make and identify mid-course corrections to ensure that outcomes are hit on the schedule indicated in the upfront agreements. And lastly, and again, something that tends to get overlooked, the board or governance support for Pay for Success business model capacity demands and reputational risk. And obviously, reputational risk can come from the fact that if a provider participates in Pay for Success and does not hit the contracted for outcome targets, that is a failure, and that will not trigger a success payment, and that's likely to get some attention. Now, before turning this over to Ruby Castlebots, I have one last slide I want to show you to give you a context in which the Department of Justice has put forth this Second Chance Act solicitation with a Pay for Success component. And that's kind of what's happening with Pay for Success financings and social impact bonds in the U.S., where they're emerging. And we'll just tick off, and this is reflective again of the fact that this is a state, local, and tribal government phenomenon in the U.S. But you can see Massachusetts has put out a Pay for Success and social impact bond request for information and a request for responses. Those responses are actually due to Massachusetts this Friday, so they're moving along robustly on their plans. Minnesota has passed legislation for human capital performance bonds, and there is a request for proposals that has been already out and awarded from a county in southern Minnesota as well. Both New York City and New York State are moving forward with social impact bond pilots, and we know of serious but as yet unannounced efforts by 6 other U.S. local and state governments to move forward Pay for Success pilot projects. That may raise the question, okay, so where is the federal government, the U.S. federal government in all of this? And that's actually going to be a good segue for us before we turn things over to Ruby. But we'll start off by mentioning that many of you may know that, that on October 21st in 2011, there was a convening that was co-hosted by the White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation and Nonprofit Finance Fund, and the title of that convening being Pay for Success, Investing in What Works. In that convening, which also followed on the Obama administration's budget request for $100 million to support Pay for Success in the 2012 budget, the goals of that convening were to create a unified conversation on Pay for Success, foster knowledge building among states and local governments for Pay for Success, to build a pipeline of communities interested in pursuing Pay for Success pilots, and to identify specific and critical actions to support the efforts of those state and local governments. And what came out of that was a very clear-cut commitment of the federal government to support Pay for Success project development and knowledge, and in particular, 2 agencies, Department of Labor and Department of Justice, indicating that they were going to move forward with ways in which they could support those pilots in their areas. And with that, what I will do is now turn it over to Ruby Castlebots, the Assistant Deputy Director, Bureau of Justice Assistance of the Department of Justice. Ruby?
Great, thank you, and thanks to all those out there that are joining us today for this webinar on incorporating a Pay for Success model into a reentry program, and how, more specifically, to apply under BJA's Open Second Chance Act solicitations. Also, thanks to Bill and the folks over at the Nonprofit Finance Fund for your assistance in hosting today's webinar and explaining the Pay for Success model. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill to field questions and answers. And joining me during the Q&A session will be Gary Dennis and Thurston Bryant, BJA Senior Policy Advisor and Policy Advisor for Corrections, and Amy Solomon, the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Attorney General. And now we can go to the next slide. The Department of Justice is interested in advancing the Pay for Success model through 3 just-released Second Chance Act solicitations. And today I'll be discussing how we see this model being incorporated into a Second Chance Act funded reentry program. I'll also discuss how Second Chance Act funds can be used within the model. And this initiative really represents a federal government incentive to pilot this new way of procuring services and outcomes. So I'll be discussing what is meant by priority consideration and how BJA will review applications and recommend awards. Moving on to the next slide is some background in funding. The Pay for Success model in the reentry context is really operational in only one location in the world, and that's Peterborough Prison, which is located about 85 miles north of London in the UK. In some U.S. jurisdictions, as you heard Bill mention toward the end of his presentation, like the state of Massachusetts, are moving forward and implementing Pay for Success models more locally. BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, currently has these 3 solicitations open under which jurisdictions can apply and can get priority consideration for incorporating the Pay for Success model. The 3 solicitations are those that you see up on the slide. It's the Offender Reentry Program for Planning and Demonstration Projects, the Reentry Program for Adult Offenders with Co-occurring Substance Abuse and Mental Health Disorders, and the third, the Family-Based Offender Substance Abuse Treatment Program. One thing I also wanted to let folks know about, again, Bill alluded to this as well, is that the Department of Labor, through its Workforce Innovation Fund, will be releasing a solicitation to also advance the Pay for Success model within a job training, attainment, and retainment context. And available on the website that you see linked on this slide are some really helpful products for DOL's initiative. And there you can find the recorded version of Labor's webinar titled Pay for Success Pilot Project National Listening Session, also their presentation slides, the transcript, and the chat logs, if that's helpful to folks. On the next slide, we'll talk about a little bit more about the Peterborough Prison example. So within Peterborough, and I bring this up simply because with Second Chance Act, the goal is to fund reentry programs and to thereby reduce recidivism. And that's the key outcome also intended within the Peterborough Prison example, which is why I bring it up here. 60% of short sentence prisoners reoffend within 1 year post-release, and they receive little statutory support to address those root causes of offending. And the first social impact bond contract there was signed with the Ministry of Justice in March of 2010 and officially launched in September of 2010. So it's also just getting its legs underneath it. Social Finance is the intermediary organization that raised £5 million from 17 different social investors to fund work with 3,000 male short sentence prisoners leaving the Peterborough Prison. They've engaged experienced social service providers that are providing those intensive supports to prisoners and their families, both inside the prison and post-release, to help with community reintegration. And the Ministry of Justice and the UK Big Lottery Fund will pay investors so long as there's a 7.5% or greater reduction in recidivism, and they measure that by reconviction, as compared to recidivism rates of a control group of other short sentence prisoners in the UK. And on the next slide, I give a graphical representation of the Peterborough model. Bill gave a graphical representation for how you can think about Pay for Success in general. This one is specific to the Peterborough example. So in this model, what some might look at as a pure social impact bond model, really it's the only, as I said, active one that we have. Activity really centers around that intermediary organization that you see there in the center. And it's the intermediary that enters into a social impact bond contract with a government entity to secure working capital and effect a specified change in behavior for that target group of people. And in this model, it's also the intermediary that secures working capital from investors and procures the providers of services to the target population to achieve the desired change. In this model, the government has pre-calculated the cost of business as usual and the amount that it's willing to spend to affect the desired change. So presumably the amount the government's willing to spend in this model is equal to or less than business as usual. And the change has got to be quantifiable and verifiable against a defined comparison group. So let's assume that the intermediary can procure the services and have the impact that the government specified among the target group for less money than business as usual costs. So in this case, the intermediary will be reimbursed, and in this model, the investors, those that supplied the working capital, will not only be reimbursed for their initial investment, but could also receive a return on their investment. In the next slide, you'll notice how we see this working within the Second Chance Act context. So on this side, you'll notice that we've added the Second Chance Act funds in light blue over on the left below the government agency and show where we think that they fit into the model. So Second Chance Act funds from these three solicitations must be awarded to the government agency and not an intermediary organization. Second Chance Act funds should be used as working capital to procure or reimburse for direct services and not pay for returns on investment from other sources of the working capital. And we see Second Chance Act funds being used this way for three reasons. Second Chance Act grants can only be awarded, this is statutorily, to units of state and local government and tribes. So that's the first one. Secondly, Second Chance Act project periods are limited in time. So it's basically 1 to 2 years depending on the program, and all that information is in the solicitation. And third, the Office of Justice Programs prohibits using funds for profit making. So for these three reasons, we see Second Chance Act funds as part of the working capital that governments can use to offset costs of achieving outcomes. In the next 4 slides, I'm going to talk about the pay for success criteria. And as a read-along or as you look at the solicitations after the webinar today, you'll notice that this is the criteria that's appended to each of the 3 solicitations. It's the last page that you'll see last 2 pages that you'll see within the solicitations. So the primary goal of the Second Chance Act is to reduce recidivism. Recidivism for the purposes of these solicitations is defined by BJA as a return to prison and or jail with either a new conviction or as a result of a violation of the terms of supervision, and that's within 12 months of initial release. Second Chance Act solicitations are pretty clear on the priority to serve a high-risk target population, with one exception, that of the family-based solicitation, which places priority on applications targeting a medium to high-risk offender group. And they also have a priority focus on geographic areas to which applicants can demonstrate a disproportionate number of offenders are returning. All these same truths apply for those seeking priority consideration for pay for success. The primary goal of recidivism reduction, the targeting of higher risk offenders, the focus on geographic areas disproportionately affected by the high volumes of returning ex-offenders, and a focus on evidence-based practices and programs all also apply to proposed pay for success projects. An applicant should describe the number of offenders to be served, the overall recidivism goal for that group, and describe specific services and interventions to be provided to the target group. On the next slide, we really get into the pay for success investment and agreement. And again, this tracks with the selection criteria appended to the solicitations. So where applications will start to look different is in the description of how funds, if awarded, would be used to support the pay for success model. And we envision Second Chance Act grant funds will be used, as I mentioned earlier, as a portion of the working capital to pay for direct services or to reimburse for outcomes achieved during the project period. But as I mentioned before, it can't be used to pay a return on invested capital provided by others. Applicants should identify the source or sources of the additional working capital and provide evidence of its availability. An applicant should also identify all parties to the agreement, including any intermediaries or other management organizations. BJA is going to internally review applications that propose a pay for success model, and we're going to look for strength, or evidence rather, of the strength of the commitment from the partners described. On the next slide, I'll talk a bit about outcomes and measures. So with regard to outcome measurement, applicants should specify their recidivism reduction goal for the selected target population. And in this model, a monetary value should also be assigned for the achievement of those desired recidivism reduction outcomes. Applicants should also describe the evaluation methodology, including 4 things. So the metrics, the timing, the independence, and the comparison groups. And you should also discuss any interim measures that can indicate progress towards outcomes achievement, including how interim data could be used to improve program efficacy. In the next slide, again, this is reiterating what Second Chance Act funds can and can't be used for. We really see them as part of the working capital that can pay for provision of services for offenders, either by the grantee to a service provider or to a service provider through an intermediary organization, so one of those 3 options. Due to the time and the limitations of these Second Chance Act funds, that's how we see the best use of these funds. On the next slide, this is getting at eligibility and availability. Again, all of this information is in the solicitations, but I think it's a fair point to reiterate here. So applicants are limited to state and local government agencies and to federally recognized Indian tribes. As far as availability, within the 3 solicitations, they slightly differ. One thing that I really want to highlight and point out here, and it's bolded, under the first solicitation, the Adult Offender Reentry Planning and Demonstration Program, there's 2 options in 2 categories. The first one, for those that potentially are not as far along in the development of a reentry plan, perhaps don't have all the stakeholders on board, or this added option of looking to incorporate a pay-for-success model in the reentry program, can come in for 1 year for the time of 1 year and money, meaning $50,000, to engage within a planning process. The second category, also for 1 year, is $750,000 for full-blown demonstration projects, and those it's fully anticipated would need to provide evidence of meeting all of the requirements of the Second Chance Act. The second solicitation addresses those offenders with co-occurring disorders who are reentering community. The timing here is different, and the amount available is also slightly different. So these are for a maximum of 2 years and up to $600,000. And the third focuses on family-based adult offender substance abuse treatment. So it's treatment for offenders behind the walls, pre-release, also post-release services, and gives jurisdictions an opportunity to do outreach to the community and serve the children and other family members, as we know that children are negatively impacted by an incarcerated parent. And those are available for 2 years up to $300,000. One thing that's also fair to mention and is in the solicitation is that I think it's very difficult in our experience with jurisdictions to be able to stand up and complete these programs within the time frames that you see here. No cost extensions are available for all of these programs. On the next slide is the deadline in the review process. Basically midnight on 1 minute before on April 24th. And the review process is as follows. So applications are going to be read and scored. Those, let me preempt that by saying that first, all applications will go through a review for basic minimum requirements. All those that meet those very basic requirements, mostly with regard to eligibility, will go on and be read and scored by panels of external peer reviewers against the Second Chance Act selection criteria. And those criteria include the problem statement, the project design, capabilities and competencies, performance measurement, collaboration, and the budget. BJA staff also read applications to ensure that all requirements, which are mandatory under the Act, are met. And high-scoring applications, which propose to incorporate a pay-for-success model, will be reviewed internally by BJA staff. And these applicants will also be contacted by BJA to confirm the status of the pay-for-success model implementation and to seek any clarity needed on any elements, pay-for-success elements of the proposal. On the next slide, we provide the contact information that's also available within the solicitations for any future inquiries. It's best that all future inquiries outside of the webinar today be addressed via phone or email to BJA's Justice Information Center, who compile and give us a good sense of what are the frequently asked questions so that we can update those FAQs on BJA's site. And the Justice Information Center is open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5, and that's Eastern Time. And on the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Bill now. That's going to conclude my remarks. But my name is Ruby Castlebots, and the next three people that you see on this slide will be the ones that will respond to your questions. And I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Thank you, Ruby. We had initially in the question flows a lot of questions about whether or not these slide decks are going to be accessible and available. And I'll just reiterate that, yes, in fact, we will. This entire webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available, and the slides as well. And we expect that to be within 48 hours, and that'll be available certainly on the Nonprofit Finance Fund Learning Hub website, www.payforsuccess.org. Right, so that's just that general question we can take care of fairly easily. I do have a whole series of questions, so let me start. What I'll do is I'll read out the question, turn it over to Ruby, and Ruby or one of her associates will be responding to the questions. So the first one is just to reiterate, what is the outcome or outcomes DOJ is trying to accomplish with the Pay for Success preference? What's the intent here? Ruby?
Sure. So the intent for Justice is to use Second Chance Act funds to really incentivize jurisdictions to procure outcomes and not just outputs. With the preference, or what we call priority consideration, I think it's really important to note and reiterate that all of the mandatory requirements of the Second Chance Act have got to be met, that there's got to be a sound project design, that all the collaborating stakeholders need to be a part of this project. When all of those are met, then we will look at those that are proposing to also incorporate a pay-for-success model. So I just want folks to know that simply the mention or the incorporation of a pay-for-success model isn't the ticket to a grant. It's overlaid on top of that.
Thanks, Ruby. Second question here is, will our chances of winning a grant be hurt if we do not include a pay-for-success component? Similarly, must an application include a pay-for-success component in order to be considered for a grant?
Definitely not. So, we expect, again, a broad range of applications. You'll notice within all of the solicitations, there are a number of priority considerations. Pay for Success is one of those priority considerations this year. Not including that does not hurt one's chances within the competitive process.
Thank you, Ruby. Next question is DOJ willing to accept pay-for-success planning proposals? That is, how preliminary can plans be to be eligible for their pay-for-success funding? And had an additional comment here. We have been working on developing a pay-for-success pilot in our state for quite some time. Based on our experience, it could be difficult to develop an application with a viable pay-for-success component given the tight timeline. Planning grants could be an extremely helpful Department of Justice contribution to the development of effective pay-for-success projects. Ruby?
Sure. So as we heard Bill discuss and as you heard me discuss, it is, could be a complicated model to be able to put together to get the working capital, bring all of the partners on board that are necessary to pull this off successfully. So we fully understand that. We understand that the open solicitation period is what it is, and we encourage those that are at a level of capacity and readiness to go ahead and apply for implementation dollars. But I do, again, want to use this opportunity to highlight the planning category within the reentry demonstration program as an opportunity for folks that are, I would say, more at a point of discovery and thinking about this, but those that are serious about it but need some time and potentially some money to bring together the correct set of stakeholders and really think about how you can incorporate within a reentry program a pay-for-success model.
Great. Thank you, Ruby. Next question is, what sort of agreements with partners, for example, providers of working capital, are required? For example, will a letter of intent with contingencies, that is, final terms and conditions, be acceptable? If more formal MOUs or contracts are required, providing them in the time frame required under the solicitations may be difficult, if not infeasible.
So here again, I think folks are raising the fact that timing might be an issue. I think we realize that MOUs, formal MOUs or contracts are not absolutely required, but we will definitely be looking for evidence of the strength of the commitment of the partners that are necessary to pull this off. We'll definitely consider letters of intent. I would say that the firmer the commitment that can be demonstrated in the application would put those applications within a more competitive stance.
Thank you, Ruby. We're getting lots of questions. I'm trying to pick as intelligently as I can. The next question we have is, are there any parameters or guidance on how applicants go about monetizing outcomes that are met? Can savings be demonstrated in systems outside the criminal justice system? And I will mention that there may be questions here that require further investigation on your part, and if that's so, I think we can make mention of that and follow up on the websites.
Bill, I think that's potentially one that we'll want to follow back up with folks and look to either include it in our FAQs or in some way reflect that with NFF's help and on BJA's site.
That's fine. We'll definitely come back to that one. Let me move on to another question then. Under this model, who would be responsible for conducting the program evaluation to determine if outcomes were achieved? And I guess more specifically, what are DOJ's kind of parameters for that measurement and verification piece?
I think the answer to that question is really going to lie with the government entity who would be the grantee here and those that are providing the working capital. It's got to be the comparison group, the verification of the outcomes from each, the target group to receive funds under this schema and the comparison group. I think all entities would need to agree upon the metrics, the independence, those four things that I mentioned in an earlier slide on outcomes and measures. I think that would need to be a very well thought out and crafted part of the agreement between the government entity receiving a Second Chance Act award, whether or not they do, the government entity and those that are providing the working capital or the quote-unquote investors. I think, within the applications, BJA is going to be looking to see how applicants address that, but we certainly wouldn't dictate or mandate what that evaluation needs to look like.
Thank you, Ruby. I'm going to, this is an interesting question, and let me run it by you. As a point of clarification, I assume that DOJ is not seeking to enter into a pay-for-success arrangement whereby it conditions the payment of Second Chance Act funds from the federal government. That is, the grant funds are conditioned upon the success of the reentry plan that has been designed.
We are not paying you. These are not outcome payments. As I mentioned before, these funds should be looked at as a part of the working capital. The federal government obviously would not expect a return on investment. We envision that these dollars would be used in the provision of direct services or the reimbursement of direct services.
Thank you. Next question is a little more specific, but goes to the issue of eligibility. And this is someone indicating they're a public institution of higher education, which is a political subdivision of the state. Would an entity of that be eligible to make application? Yes.
I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Gary Dennis from BJA.
Yeah, we have traditionally seen universities as being, again, a subunit generally of state government. So I think the university or a higher education entity would have to demonstrate that they were clearly part of the state university college system. And in all probability, they would need to have a collaborative relationship with a correctional criminal justice agency. It could be a state department of corrections, or it could be a local department of corrections. But they could be the lead agency as long as they were able to demonstrate that they were clearly a unit of the state government or state bureaucracy.
Thanks. I'm scrolling through some of the other questions here to see what other ones might be more broadly applicable to folks. Okay. Is there any support being provided in bringing investors together?
Yeah. DOJ is not engaged in bringing private funders to the table. We're not serving in that broker's role. Bill, I don't know whether a nonprofit finance fund could offer any assistance with that question.
That would not be a role that we would play either. And there are intermediaries that do play that role in the marketplace, and actually information about them is something you can find on the Learning Hub website.
Yeah, I was just going to reinforce that. One of the positive impacts of the Second Chance Act over the last 3 years has been to really serve as a catalyst for enhanced collaborative efforts between private philanthropic sources, government agencies, and the private nonprofit sector. And as Bill indicated, there are some particular private foundations, I think of the Public Welfare Foundation, that have really emerged as leaders in trying to bring together collaborative efforts. So while the Department of Justice itself could not serve as that convener, I'm guessing that there are a good number of other private nonprofits or foundations that could be recruited to be helpful in that role.
Thanks for that clarification. Now, an interesting question here. Would an appropriate use of grant funds be for government to pay itself and either or both intermediary and service providers for adapting their operations to carry out the planned pay-for-success model? I think I understand that question.
You know, that sounds like a tricky question, Bill, but you know, I think we'd have to weigh what they interpreted paying themselves to do. If it were capacity building in terms of perhaps training their staff and better understanding the model, I expect something like that might be an allowable expense, but that would have to be weighed over against the federal financial guide just to make sure it was allowable. But I honestly think that capacity building to culture change within an organization to help them better be adapted to implementing a pay-for-success model could certainly be counted as an allowable expense if it were, again, cast in the same mode of training or capacity building.
Thank you. Here's another one. This is one that's kind of worthwhile clarifying since the question has come up, but I think it may have been addressed in the presentation, but let's ask it. Since in a pay-for-success project, there is no reimbursement for services provided, or rather payment for outcomes, can Department of Justice funds be used to pay for outcomes, or can they only be used as working capital?
I phrased this as in the presentation that they should be seen as working capital, but if so they can be used for the government entities to provide direct services, for the government entity to either contract directly with a service provider or to contract with a service provider through an intermediary to reimburse for those services. Those are allowable. So in that context, if outcomes can be achieved via direct services within the project period of the grant, yes, Second Chance Act funds can be used to reimburse those outcomes. But the caveat here, and this is, again, something that I mentioned a couple times during the presentation, is it can't be used for a return on investment. It can't be used for profit or to pay interest to those others who provided working capital.
Thank you, Ruby. Next question is, who bites the bullet financially for failed programs? The government entity or the organizations the government entity contracted with to provide direct service?
Model, as we described it, it would be those that provided the working capital. I mean, the assumption in this model is that, of course, there's some altruism, but also those that are looking to make a return on investment. What we're saying is Second Chance Act funds can be used to offset some of that working capital, and the federal government obviously would not be expecting a return on investment. So you can look at it as a contribution to the working capital. But for those other entities that are providing working capital and were anticipating a return on investment and don't get it because outcomes were not achieved, I guess those are the folks that are biting the bullet within the model.
Thanks, Ruby. This might actually be a helpful question for the group at large. Can you give an example of what type of program BJA envisions? For example, types of investors, types of outcomes, kind of an illustrative example, perhaps?
I would go back to Peterborough there, and that's why I spent some time on that within the presentation, simply because it lends itself well as an example of another reentry program. And I think Gary's jumping to chime in here, but the major purpose of the Second Chance Act is to achieve recidivism reduction. That is the overarching outcome. And you can go to all of the performance measures. Are viewable online on BJA's site, where you can get a look at the performance metrics that we're looking for. The overarching one, like I said, is recidivism reduction. We also do look at some functional outcomes, such as job and housing attainment and retainment. Those are also important too, so I would imagine you could look at those within the reentry context, but overarching is recidivism reduction.
Let me throw out this as a possible scenario. Let's take Bryant County, for instance, who is having trouble maintaining their county jail. And so they are looking at ways to reduce recidivism, which would have the resultant impact of reducing the number of people that would be in their county jail. If they could do that, they might close a wing of their county jail and save money. So we could envision a robust reentry program that would be partly funded by Second Chance money that would pay for direct services, for housing, or all of those ancillary things that support positive reentry. Bryant County then would could recruit private investors to provide the private working capital that would go in with the idea that if they were able to achieve a significant reduction or agreed upon reduction in recidivism, which resulted in allowing them to close a wing of the county jail and resulted in what would be significant savings, then the county might be willing to return a portion of that money saved as the incentive, if you will, or the return on investment for those local people who were willing to chime in to help it out, as long as that money was over and above funds that had originally been counted as match in the project. So I think what we're looking at are really creative collaborations of folks, but there needs to be, I think there's an earlier question about quantifying the savings. Recidivism reduction itself has got to somehow translate into savings, whether it's reducing the number of people who come through a prison, closing a wing of a jail, and that's something that we're seeing more and more correctional facilities do now, particularly in some cases as prison populations and jail populations are dwindling. But I think that's the type of scenario where you can see these pieces fitting together.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks. Another question here is, who sets the thresholds for success that trigger the government paying back the working capital providers?
That would need to be worked out between the government entity and those that it was contracting with for the working capital. And I would imagine in Gary's example and the Peterborough example, all of this has got to be quantified, and as I mentioned too. So you've got to have a real strong sense of how much it costs to achieve what you're achieving now doing business as usual, and how much you're willing to spend in any savings that you might achieve by somebody else doing it potentially better as interest or return on investment.
Thank you, Ruby. I'm going to ask this question, even though I don't really know what the acronyms refer to, but I assume that you all will. And the question is, can the SSA, as the grantee, pay the DOC to provide the direct service?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Okay, sure. Can the SSA, as the grantee, pay the DOC to provide the direct service?
I might need, so the SSA is the,
should be SAA.
I'm assuming that means there's SSA, which is the state the Substance Abuse Authority, which is the recipient of substance abuse block grant funds, federal government block grant funds. We deal with SAAs, which are the state administering authorities for the criminal justice block grant funds. I would probably need to see a little bit more detail within an application, but I could foresee that that's an allowable pass-through of funds. That obviously an eligible applicant would be a state administering authority for criminal justice funds, and a direct provider of services could be the DOC for certainly pre-release services at the least.
Yeah, I think it begs the question a bit. Why would you want an SAA to do that when the grant could go directly to the State Department of Corrections? But in thinking this through, it could be that the SAA, the State Administrative Agency, because generally those are attached to the governor's office and state government, might be more successful at recruiting potential private investors. But I think it sort of begs the question about why the SAA would want to do that.
Okay. Here's a fairly technical clarification question. For the one-year planning project, is there a matching fund requirement or pay-for-success criteria?
Yeah, yes, there is a matching requirement. Unfortunately, the Second Chance Act in Section 101, where these funds come from, require a 50% match. 25% of that is a hard cash match and 25% in kind. Congress did put in a provision in our appropriation that allows for the grantee to request under a hardship a waiver of the cash match. So the short answer is that for that $50,000 grant, the awardee would have to put up $50,000 of in-kind match.
Thanks. And here's one also for some technical clarification. A key outcome area for the family-based SA treatment grant is recidivism rates, generally measured 2 or 3 years out from treatment. How would success be measured and drive payments in this case?
So I think, as I talked about also within the presentation, is that, and as folks are mentioning through questions, that timing is an issue here. We are statutorily required to make awards for the project periods that are posted within the solicitation, but based on past experience, the majority of grantees have come back in for no-cost extensions. And unless there's a good reason not to grant a no-cost extension, we are generally supportive of allowing project periods to continue on, knowing that it's difficult within these time frames to be able to provide services and see outcomes achieved.
Thanks, and our last question is now coming up, and it is as follows. So it sounds like the Second Chance Act is assuming that there is a sophisticated financial understanding, well connected to potential investors, and understanding of effective and proven nonprofit providers. Is this asking too much from a government agency? Why not leave this work up to a financial intermediary such as social finance or another organization?
I hope folks can still hear us. We talked about the model as potentially including an intermediary organization. What we're proposing to support does not exclude or preclude an intermediary organization. If that is the way that a government entity chooses to go, I think that certainly works here. It's just that for us, for the Second Chance Act, for the programs that we're talking about, eligible applicants are units of local government. But we fully imagine and hope to see applications from those folks on the line and others for incorporating a pay-for-success model into a reentry program, and we anticipate a lot of those applications will include something that looks like an intermediary organization that can help a government entity make sense of all of this, gain partnerships, seek working capital, procure evidence-based service provision for offenders that we're looking to serve here.
Thank you, Ruby, and thank you to the entire team from BJA, and thank you all for participating in the webinar. We are done, and I would say again that you should be checking out the NFF Learning Hub website for the slides, for the recording of this in the next 4 to 8 hours, and for some of the Q&A that we couldn't address during this session, though I will tell you we addressed almost all of the questions that came up. There were repeat questions of the sort that we did answer. So again, thank you all for your interest, and thank you all for the robust Q&A session. And also I know that that DOJ has their website available that'll have both some Q&A from this and some frequently asked questions as well. So thank you again.
Thank you.